The hardest goodbyes are the ones spoken without a single word. The grand hall of the Mooncrest Palace shimmered beneath thousands of crystal lights, each one reflecting across polished marble floors where generations of Alpha Kings had chosen the women who would stand beside them. Noble families filled the towering chamber, their elegant gowns and tailored coats blending into a sea of silver, ivory, and midnight blue. Every whispered conversation carried the same anticipation. Tonight, the Alpha King would make his choice. Charlotte Brooks stood quietly near the back of the gathering, her simple cream-colored dress setting her apart from the jeweled Omega daughters surrounding her. She wore no sparkling crown, no expensive necklace, no embroidered silk. The only thing she carried was hope, fragile and invisible, hidden behind calm hazel eyes that refused to reveal everything her heart was feeling. She had known Adrian Ashford since they were children. They had learned to ride horses across the same hills, planted young oak trees beside the palace gardens, and laughed together beneath summer skies before duty became heavier than dreams. Over the years, quiet affection had grown naturally between them, never spoken aloud, yet never completely hidden. Many within the palace believed everyone already knew how this evening would end. Charlotte believed it too. At the far end of the hall, enormous wooden doors slowly opened. Silence swept through the crowd as Adrian entered wearing the ceremonial black cloak reserved only for reigning Alpha Kings. Silver embroidery traced the ancient crest of his bloodline across broad shoulders, while the royal crown rested lightly above dark hair. He looked every bit the leader his kingdom expected him to become, yet anyone watching closely could see the unusual weight behind his steady gray eyes. Duty had stolen something from him long before this ceremony had begun. Advisors lined both sides of the royal platform. Noble elders exchanged subtle nods. Every movement inside the hall followed traditions older than memory itself. Adrian climbed the marble steps without hesitation, but when his gaze drifted across the gathering, it paused for only the briefest moment on Charlotte. Neither smiled, neither spoke. Still, an entire lifetime seemed to pass between that single glance. Then the master of ceremonies announced the moment everyone had been waiting for. Adrian stepped forward and extended his hand toward Lady Victoria Sterling, the daughter of the most influential noble family in the Northern Territories. A soft gasp rippled across the hall before thunderous applause quickly followed. Victoria accepted with perfect grace, her jeweled gown catching the brilliant light as she joined him upon the royal platform. Charlotte did not move. She simply watched as two people stood beneath the blessing of the kingdom while the future everyone once imagined quietly disappeared. No tears filled her eyes. No anger crossed her face. The deepest heartbreak often arrives too gently for anyone else to notice. Around her, conversations immediately shifted toward wedding preparations, political alliances, and the prosperity this union would supposedly bring. No one noticed the young woman stepping away from the celebration. No one asked whether she was all right. She walked slowly through familiar palace corridors where every painting, every window, and every stone carried memories too precious to keep. Outside, the evening air felt colder than it had only an hour earlier. Moonlight stretched across the palace gardens where an old oak tree still stood, now taller than the two children who had planted it years ago. Charlotte stopped beneath its branches and looked down at the simple silver bracelet resting around her wrist, a quiet promise exchanged long before crowns and kingdoms had complicated everything. With steady hands, she slipped it free and placed it carefully at the foot of the tree. There were no dramatic words, no desperate farewell, only one slow breath before she turned toward the palace gates. Before sunrise, her small room would already be empty. By the following evening, every road leading away from the capital would carry the same unanswered question. Charlotte Brooks had vanished, and not a single person knew where she had gone. Charlotte Brooks did not look back as the capital disappeared behind rolling hills wrapped in the pale light of dawn. The familiar stone towers slowly faded into the distance until they became nothing more than shadows against the horizon, and with every mile her old life seemed to dissolve into the quiet rhythm of the road ahead. She traveled alone with a single leather satchel slung across her shoulder, carrying only a few changes of clothing, several family recipes carefully folded inside a weathered notebook, and enough silver coins to survive a few weeks if she spent them wisely. She had no destination, only one promise whispered silently to herself beneath the morning sky. She would never again build her future around someone else's choice. 3 days later, she arrived at White Valley, a forgotten border town tucked between gentle mountains and wide open fields. It was not the kind of place noble families ever visited. The roads were uneven, many storefronts stood empty, and the faded wooden signs above old buildings leaned slightly after years of harsh winters. Yet beneath the worn appearance lived people who greeted strangers with cautious kindness rather than polished smiles. Charlotte rented the smallest room above an aging bakery owned by an elderly widow named Margaret Ellis. The room contained little more than a narrow bed, a wooden chair beside a single window, and a tiny stove that struggled to warm the space during chilly evenings. It was modest, but for the first time in many months, the silence around her belonged entirely to her. Every morning before sunrise, Charlotte helped Margaret prepare fresh bread for the town. She kneaded dough until her hands ached, swept flour from wooden floors, arranged warm loaves on simple shelves, and greeted customers with genuine warmth. Most people assumed she had always lived a quiet life. No one recognized the young woman who had once walked through palace gardens beside a future king. She never corrected them. In the afternoons, she quietly mended torn coats for farmers, repaired children's winter scarves, and used the herbal remedies her grandmother had taught her to ease coughs and sore muscles. She accepted only fair payment, and when someone could not afford it, she simply smiled and wished them a better tomorrow. Weeks slowly became months. The empty bakery began welcoming more visitors each morning. Travelers stopped for fresh bread before continuing across the border. Local families lingered over warm pastries and coffee, sharing stories that filled the little shop with laughter Charlotte had almost forgotten she could enjoy. Margaret often watched her from across the counter with quiet admiration. "You have a way of making people believe tomorrow will be kinder than today," the elderly woman said one snowy evening while closing the shop. Charlotte looked through the frosted window at children building snowmen beneath glowing street lamps. Perhaps people only need someone to remind them they still have tomorrow. At night, when the bakery finally grew quiet, she sometimes thought about the palace she had left behind. The memories still existed, but they no longer carried the sharp ache they once had. They felt like pages from a book she had already finished reading. She never asked visitors about the capital. She never wondered whether anyone searched for her. Healing, she discovered, did not arrive all at once. It came quietly, hidden inside ordinary mornings, shared smiles, warm bread fresh from the oven, and the comforting realization that a peaceful life built with her own hands would always be stronger than a dream that depended upon someone else choosing her. Seasons passed with quiet determination, and White Valley slowly began changing in ways its people had almost stopped believing were possible. The old bakery expanded into the neighboring, empty storefront after customers started lining up before sunrise each morning. Fresh bread remained the heart of the business, but Charlotte Brooks saw needs that stretched far beyond warm meals. She organized shelves filled with affordable blankets before winter arrived, stocked handmade clothing stitched by local widows who needed steady work, and created small baskets of dried herbs for families unable to travel long distances whenever illness spread through neighboring farms. None of it happened overnight. Every improvement grew from countless ordinary days filled with patience rather than grand ambition. The people of White Valley noticed. Farmers who had once struggled alone began helping one another repair broken fences before storms. Skilled carpenters volunteered to rebuild abandoned shops. Young apprentices found work learning trades instead of leaving town in search of uncertain futures elsewhere. Charlotte never called herself a leader. She simply listened whenever someone spoke about a problem and quietly searched for practical solutions. Her greatest talent was making people believe their own abilities mattered. Margaret Ellis watched the transformation with proud disbelief. One evening, she stood beside Charlotte outside the bakery as children laughed while chasing one another through the town square, their parents relaxing on newly built benches beneath glowing lanterns. "Do you realize what you have done?" Margaret asked softly. Charlotte followed her gaze toward the lively streets. "I only baked bread." Margaret smiled knowingly. "No, you gave people a reason to stay." Those words settled deeply inside Charlotte's heart. She had once believed her future depended upon walking beside someone destined to wear a crown. Instead, She had discovered that purpose often waited inside the smallest acts repeated faithfully every single day. By the beginning of the third year, neighboring villages regularly traveled to White Valley to trade goods, learn new farming techniques, and purchase supplies crafted by local families. Charlotte encouraged every talented artisan to sell their work together instead of competing against one another. Blacksmiths shared equipment. Bakers exchanged recipes. Seamstresses trained young girls eager to learn a profession. Prosperity spread because no one was expected to succeed alone. The old warehouse near the edge of town became a school during the mornings and a gathering hall every evening. Elderly craftsmen taught practical skills while retired teachers offered reading lessons to children whose families had never been able to afford formal education. Charlotte often remained quietly in the back of the room, smiling as she watched neighbors helping neighbors without. Realizing they had become something extraordinary, visitors soon began asking the same question wherever they traveled. Who was the woman responsible for White Valley? The answers were surprisingly similar. Some called her the heart of the valley. Others called her the woman who never turned anyone away. Children simply called her Miss Charlotte. No one mentioned kingdoms, alpha kings, or forgotten ceremonies from years before. Those belonged to another lifetime. One crisp autumn afternoon, a merchant arriving from the southern trade routes paused beside the bakery after delivering supplies. He looked around the thriving town with open admiration before turning toward Margaret. "Remarkable," he said. "I passed through here 5 years ago. This place was barely surviving." Margaret glanced toward Charlotte, who was helping a little boy carry a basket far too heavy for his small arms. "It was," she replied with quiet pride. Then one young woman arrived carrying almost nothing except kindness and the courage to begin again. Charlotte never heard the conversation. She was too busy laughing as the little boy proudly insisted he could carry the basket himself. For the first time in many years, the sound of her own laughter no longer surprised her. It simply sounded like home. While White Valley flourished beneath Charlotte Brooks's quiet leadership, life inside the royal capital followed a very different path. Adrian Ashford had fulfilled every duty expected of an alpha king. He attended council meetings before sunrise, negotiated trade agreements, welcomed noble families into the palace, and carried the weight of an entire kingdom across his shoulders with unwavering discipline. From the outside, his reign appeared stable, orderly, and respected. Yet the warmth that had once filled the palace gardens seemed to have quietly disappeared. His marriage to Lady Victoria Sterling remained courteous, but it resembled a carefully arranged partnership more than the joyful future the kingdom had celebrated years earlier. They shared responsibilities with mutual respect, yet silence often settled between them during long evenings inside the grand dining hall. Even the servants noticed that the palace had grown quieter. One autumn afternoon, Adrian attended a gathering of merchants from neighboring territories to discuss expanding trade routes. Maps covered a polished oak table, while representatives eagerly described the rapid growth of a border region few nobles had previously considered important. One elderly merchant smiled as he unfolded a ledger filled with remarkable figures. "Your Majesty, if current trends continue, White Valley will become one of the strongest commercial centers in the Northern Territories within a few years." Adrian looked up with mild curiosity. "White Valley?" The merchant nodded enthusiastically. "An extraordinary place. New workshops, schools, farms, bakeries, textile houses, and trade markets continue opening every season. Families are moving there instead of leaving. Even neighboring villages have begun following their model." Another merchant added, "The most remarkable part is that everything seems to revolve around one woman. She refuses titles, yet everyone willingly follows her example." Adrian leaned back thoughtfully. "Who is she?" The merchants exchanged uncertain glances before one answered with a smile. "No one speaks about her past. They simply call her Miss Charlotte." The name drifted through the room so gently that no one else noticed the subtle change in Adrian's expression. His fingers tightened almost imperceptibly around the edge of the table before relaxing again. Surely it could not be the same Charlotte. The kingdom was large. Countless women shared that name. Still, something deep within him refused to dismiss the possibility. That evening, after the council had ended and the palace corridors had grown quiet, Adrian wandered into the old royal gardens without realizing where his steps had taken him. Moonlight spilled across familiar stone pathways until he reached the towering oak tree planted many years earlier by two children who believed the future would always remain simple. The tree had grown broad and strong, its branches stretching proudly toward the stars. As Adrian rested one hand against its weathered trunk, his eyes caught the faint glimmer of silver near its roots. Carefully brushing aside fallen leaves, he uncovered the simple bracelet Charlotte had left behind on the night she disappeared. Time had dulled its shine, but not its meaning. He held it carefully in his palm, while memories returned with startling clarity. The laughter shared beneath summer skies. Long conversations that needed no grand promises. Quiet moments that had once seemed ordinary until they were gone. For the first time in many years, Adrian wondered whether the greatest mistake of his life had not been choosing according to duty, but believing that duty required him to ignore what his own heart had quietly known all along. Far beyond the palace walls, under another peaceful autumn sky, Charlotte stood beside the bustling marketplace in White Valley as families celebrated the opening of a new community hall built entirely through neighbors helping neighbors. She smiled while children tied colorful ribbons across the entrance, completely unaware that somewhere hundreds of miles away, a forgotten bracelet had finally reminded an alpha king that some choices never truly stopped echoing. Several weeks later, an official invitation bearing the royal seal arrived in White Valley, carried by a messenger who expected to deliver it to a mayor, a governor, or perhaps an aging merchant prince. Instead, he found Charlotte Brooks standing outside the community bakery with flour lightly dusting her sleeves as she helped unload fresh wheat from a farmer's wagon. The young messenger looked around in confusion before carefully unfolding the elegant parchment. "I have been instructed to deliver this personally to the leader of White Valley," he announced. The surrounding townspeople smiled knowingly before one elderly carpenter pointed toward Charlotte. "You have already found her." The messenger blinked in disbelief. He looked from the beautifully written invitation back to the woman tying an apron around her waist. "Miss Charlotte Brooks." She accepted the letter with quiet courtesy. "Thank you for making such a long journey." After the messenger departed, she waited until the afternoon work was finished before opening the seal. Inside was a formal request from the Royal Council inviting White Valley to participate in a summit bringing together the fastest-growing regions across the Northern Territories. The kingdom wished to establish new trade partnerships and hoped White Valley would share its successful model of community development. Charlotte slowly folded the letter and looked through the bakery window where young apprentices laughed while learning to shape bread beside Margaret Ellis. She understood immediately that declining would only limit opportunities for the people who had placed their trust in her. This journey would not be about revisiting the past. It would be about protecting the future they had built together. Several days later, White Valley's delegation arrived at the royal capital beneath a bright spring sky. The city had changed surprisingly little. The familiar stone walls still stood proudly above crowded streets. Fountains continued sparkling inside elegant courtyards, and the palace towers reached confidently toward the clouds. Charlotte noticed everything without lingering on any memory. She had returned not as the uncertain young Omega who had quietly disappeared years before, but as a respected representative carrying the hopes of an entire community. Inside the Grand Council chamber, regional leaders gathered around a massive circular table crafted from polished oak. Discussions had already begun when the tall double doors opened once more. Every conversation faded into respectful silence as Charlotte entered with calm confidence, dressed in a beautifully tailored but understated ivory traveling suit that reflected dignity rather than luxury. She carried no royal symbols, no jeweled ornaments, only neatly organized documents and years of earned experience. Adrian Ashford looked up from the reports before him, expecting another provincial delegate. The moment his eyes met hers, time seemed to pause. Charlotte had changed, yet she remained unmistakably herself. The kindness in her hazel eyes had only grown steadier. The quiet grace he remembered had become unshakable confidence. She did not hesitate, did not lower her gaze, and did not appear surprised to see him. She simply offered the same respectful nod she gave every other representative before taking her seat across the table. Around them, council members continued discussing trade routes, agricultural innovations, and education programs, completely unaware that two people separated by years of silence had just found one another again. Adrian tried to focus on the presentation unfolding before him, but every carefully prepared sentence seemed to disappear beneath a single realization. The woman he had once believed needed the palace had built something extraordinary without it. Charlotte calmly presented White Valley's cooperative model, explaining how shared knowledge, fair opportunity, and mutual respect had transformed struggling families into thriving communities. Her voice remained steady, warm, and practical. There was no trace of bitterness, no hidden accusation, only quiet pride in the people she represented. As the room filled with genuine admiration for her work, Adrian finally understood the truth he had spent years avoiding. Charlotte Brooks had never vanished because she had been broken. She had simply walked toward a future where she no longer needed anyone else's permission to become everything she was capable of being. The council meeting ended as the last rays of afternoon sunlight stretched across the polished marble floor, leaving quiet conversations drifting through the grand chamber while representatives gathered their documents and prepared for the evening reception. Charlotte Brooks carefully organized her notes before thanking the delegates seated nearby for their thoughtful questions. She spoke with the same calm confidence she had carried throughout the summit, never seeking attention, never lingering where admiration gathered. As the room gradually emptied, she stepped into the palace garden through a pair of tall glass doors, welcoming the peaceful silence after a long day. Spring flowers filled the familiar pathways with soft color, and the old oak tree still stood proudly beneath the golden sky. Charlotte paused beside it, smiling faintly as memories passed through her heart without bringing pain. They no longer belonged to a wound. They belonged to another chapter of her life. Gentle footsteps approached across the stone path. She turned and found Adrian Ashford standing several feet away. He wore no ceremonial cloak, no royal crown, only a simple dark coat that made him appear less like a king and more like the young man she had once known beneath these very branches. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The evening breeze carried the scent of fresh blossoms while birds settled quietly among the trees. Adrian finally broke the silence. "I searched for you." Charlotte met his eyes with quiet honesty. "I know." He looked surprised. She smiled gently. "People talk." Messengers visited neighboring towns years ago, asking whether anyone had seen a young woman traveling alone. "I heard about them long after they stopped looking." Adrian lowered his gaze. "I should have searched sooner." Charlotte rested one hand against the rough bark of the oak tree. "Perhaps, but neither of us can walk backward through time." He reached into his coat pocket and carefully removed the simple silver bracelet he had discovered beneath the tree weeks earlier. Holding it with both hands, he stepped forward and offered it to her. "I found this where you left it." Charlotte looked at the bracelet for several quiet seconds before accepting it with grateful hands. She traced the worn silver gently with her fingertips and smiled, not because it reopened old feelings, but because it reminded her how far she had traveled since the night she had placed it beneath the tree. Adrian's voice softened. "I thought choosing duty would protect the kingdom. I never realized it would cost me someone who believed in me before I ever wore a crown." Charlotte looked toward the lively gardens where palace workers tended flower beds with quiet dedication. "We were both younger then. We believed every decision lasted forever." Adrian nodded slowly. "If I could choose again." She gently interrupted him, not with anger, but with kindness. "You cannot return to a season that has already become history." Those words settled peacefully between them. There was no bitterness inside her voice, only acceptance earned through years of rebuilding a life with her. On hands, Adrian understood that she was not punishing him. She was simply living in a future that no longer depended upon the past. After a thoughtful silence, Charlotte continued. "White Valley still hopes to establish fair trade with the capital. Our farmers can provide grain during difficult harvests, and our schools would gladly exchange teachers with neighboring towns." Adrian looked at her with quiet admiration. Even now, she chose cooperation over regret. "Then we will begin there," he answered. "Not because of what we once were, but because of what our people deserve." Charlotte smiled warmly. "That sounds like the decision of a good king." As the evening bells echoed softly across the palace grounds, they walked together toward the main courtyard, no longer carrying the weight of unfinished conversations. They were not returning to the life they had lost. They were choosing a future built upon mutual respect, shared purpose, and the quiet understanding that sometimes the greatest act of love is allowing someone to become exactly who they were always meant to be, even if their path no longer leads back to yours. The weeks following the summit marked the beginning of an unexpected partnership between the royal capital and White Valley. Trade routes once overlooked by noble merchants quickly became busy with wagons carrying grain, handcrafted furniture, woven textiles, fresh bread, and carefully prepared herbal remedies. Families who had struggled through difficult winters found new opportunities, while young apprentices traveled between communities to learn new skills. Charlotte Brooks visited the capital only when necessary, always arriving with practical ideas instead of grand speeches, and returning home before the palace walls could begin feeling familiar again. She preferred the quiet mornings of White Valley, where children waved as she crossed the town square and neighbors greeted one another by name rather than title. Adrian Ashford noticed the difference every time she departed. Years earlier, he had believed leadership meant convincing people to remain beside him. Charlotte showed him that true leadership inspired people to return willingly, because they believed in the future being built together. During one council meeting, several nobles questioned why so many royal resources were being invested in a border town instead of expanding the capital. Adrian listened patiently before answering with calm certainty. Prosperity grows strongest where opportunity is shared. White Valley has reminded us that success belongs to every family willing to work together, not only those born inside palace walls. The room grew thoughtfully quiet. Even those who disagreed found little to challenge in the results, already transforming the kingdom. Meanwhile, Charlotte continued living exactly as she always had. She still helped unload flour before sunrise, visited elderly neighbors carrying warm meals, and spent evenings teaching young business owners how to manage their shops honestly and sustainably. Success had changed her circumstances, but never her character. One afternoon, Margaret Ellis watched Charlotte repairing a child's torn backpack instead of delegating the task to someone else. The elderly baker smiled and asked, "Do you ever wonder what your life might have become if you had stayed?" Charlotte threaded another stitch before answering. Sometimes. She looked through the bakery window where customers laughed together over fresh coffee and warm bread. Then I remember that leaving gave me the chance to discover who I was without waiting for someone else to define me. Margaret nodded with quiet understanding. News of White Valley's remarkable progress soon spread beyond the northern territories. Visitors arrived not simply to trade, but to learn. They expected to find magnificent government buildings or powerful officials directing every decision. Instead, they found neighbors planting community gardens together, teachers volunteering extra hours after school, and business owners mentoring new entrepreneurs instead of treating them as competitors. They often left saying the same thing. White Valley had not become successful because one remarkable woman did everything herself. It had become successful because one remarkable woman had convinced ordinary people that they were capable of accomplishing extraordinary things together. Late one autumn evening, Adrian visited White Valley without royal ceremony, accompanied only by a single carriage and 2 attendants waiting respectfully at the edge of town. He found Charlotte standing outside the bakery beneath strings of warm lanterns as families gathered for the annual harvest festival. Music drifted gently through the crisp air while children danced across the square, holding baskets of bright autumn leaves. Adrian smiled as he watched neighbors greeting Charlotte with genuine affection. No formal announcements were made when he arrived. No one rushed to impress a king. They simply welcomed another guest into their celebration. Charlotte walked over carrying 2 cups of warm apple cider and handed one to him with an easy smile. "You chose a good evening to visit." Adrian accepted the cup gratefully and looked around at the joyful gathering. "I think I finally understand why this place feels different." Charlotte glanced toward the families laughing beneath the lanterns. "Why?" Adrian answered softly. "Because no one here is trying to become more important than anyone else. They are simply helping one another live better lives." Charlotte smiled, her eyes reflecting the warm lights dancing across the square. That was always the dream. Standing there beneath the autumn sky, neither of them wished to rewrite the past anymore. Instead, they quietly appreciated the unexpected truth life had revealed. Sometimes losing the future you once imagined is exactly what allows a far better one to be built. Winter gradually gave way to spring, and with every passing month the partnership between the royal capital and White Valley continued strengthening lives across the Northern Territories. New schools welcomed children from villages that had never before enjoyed regular education. Believing that every successful solution began by understanding the people it was meant to serve. She remained the same woman who had once arrived carrying little more than hope inside a worn leather satchel, even though countless visitors now traveled hundreds of miles simply to seek her guidance. One bright morning, representatives from several distant regions gathered in White Valley to discuss creating a permanent council where communities could exchange knowledge without depending entirely upon royal authority. The meeting took place inside the restored community hall that local families had built together years earlier. Sunlight poured through tall windows while maps, notebooks, and simple wooden models covered the large central table. Charlotte welcomed every guest personally, shaking hands with farmers, teachers, merchants, and village elders alike. She believed every voice deserved the same respect regardless of wealth or title. Later that afternoon, Adrian Ashford arrived quietly, accompanied by only a small delegation. He chose not to sit at the head of the table, instead taking an ordinary chair among everyone else. The decision surprised many visitors, but Charlotte noticed it immediately. Without speaking, she understood that the Alpha King had changed in ways no royal announcement could ever fully describe. Throughout the discussions, Adrian listened far more than he spoke. Whenever disagreements appeared, he encouraged each group to explain its concerns before searching for common ground. Watching him, Charlotte realized that leadership had become gentler, steadier, and perhaps even wiser than it had been years earlier. After the meeting concluded, the two of them walked slowly along the river bordering White Valley while evening sunlight shimmered across the flowing water. Wildflowers lined the path, and children could be heard laughing in the distance as they played near the old wooden bridge. Adrian looked toward the peaceful town before speaking. There was a time when I believed kingdoms were built by strong walls and loyal armies. Charlotte smiled softly. And now, he watched a father teaching his young daughter how to skip smooth stones. Across the river, now I believe they are built by people who trust one another enough to dream beyond tomorrow. Charlotte nodded. Trust grows slowly. That is why it lasts. They continued walking without hurry, comfortable in the quiet that no longer carried regret. Adrian finally stopped beside the bridge and turned toward her. Thank you, he said sincerely. Charlotte looked slightly surprised. For what? He smiled with quiet gratitude. For refusing to become bitter. The easier path would have been resentment. Instead, you built hope where others expected disappointment. Charlotte lowered her eyes briefly before looking back at him. The day I left the capital, I thought I had lost my future. Looking back now, I understand I had only lost one version of it. The words settled peacefully between them. Neither wished to rewrite the years that had passed. Those years had shaped them into the people now standing beside the river. As the first evening stars appeared overhead, bells from the community hall echoed gently across White Valley, calling families together for another shared meal. Adrian and Charlotte walked back toward the warm lights shining from every window, no longer defined by the choice that had once separated them, but by the countless lives now flourishing because each had chosen to become the best version of themselves. Several years later, travelers crossing the Northern Territories often found themselves speaking about two remarkable places in the same conversation. One was the royal capital, where an Alpha King had reshaped his kingdom by placing compassion beside tradition. The other was White Valley, where an ordinary woman had proven that lasting prosperity could grow from kindness, honesty, and neighbors willing to lift one another instead of competing for power. Together they had transformed more than trade routes. They had transformed the way people believed a community should care for its future. Charlotte Brooks never accepted a noble title, even after countless invitations from influential families. She continued living in the same comfortable home overlooking the bakery where her new life had begun. Every morning she still greeted familiar faces on her walk through the town square, stopped to admire children proudly carrying books to school, and spent time listening whenever someone knocked on her door with a question or concern. The success surrounding White Valley had never belonged to one person alone. and she quietly reminded everyone of that whenever they praised her. "A single candle can begin the light," she often said with a gentle smile. "But it is many flames together that brighten an entire home." Adrian Ashford carried those words with him during every council meeting. Under his leadership, the kingdom invested more heavily in schools, farming communities, local businesses, and public gathering places than in monuments celebrating royal achievements. He encouraged governors to visit towns personally instead of ruling only from behind palace walls. Little by little, trust replaced distance between leaders and the people they served. Many older advisors admitted they had never witnessed such steady change accomplished with so little conflict. On the first day of every spring, Charlotte visited the royal capital to attend the annual gathering of community leaders. The meetings had become less formal over the years, filled with open discussions rather than elaborate ceremonies. After the final session ended, she and Adrian often walked through the palace gardens where the great oak tree still spread its wide branches across the quiet lawn. The simple silver bracelet rested safely inside a small wooden box in Charlotte's home, no longer as a symbol of heartbreak, but as a reminder that even painful endings could become the beginning of a wiser life. One warm afternoon, they paused beneath the tree while children from visiting villages laughed nearby during an educational festival hosted inside the palace grounds. Adrian watched them with a peaceful expression. "Years ago, I believed choosing correctly meant making everyone happy," he said softly. Charlotte smiled as she watched a little girl proudly show her drawing to her teacher. "Sometimes there is no perfect choice," she answered. "There is only the choice that teaches us who we become afterward." Adrian nodded thoughtfully. He no longer wished the past had unfolded differently. Without those difficult years, neither of them would have discovered the purpose waiting beyond disappointment. As the sun slowly settled behind the palace towers, golden light stretched across the gardens exactly as it had on the evening Charlotte quietly walked away long ago. Everything looked familiar, yet everything had changed. She was no longer the young Omega waiting to be chosen. She had become a woman who built opportunities for countless others. Adrian was no longer the uncertain king burdened by impossible expectations. He had become a leader who understood that true strength was measured not by authority, but by the lives improved because of thoughtful decisions. They stood together for one final moment before walking toward the palace gates, each returning to responsibilities they embraced willingly. Their paths no longer depended upon one another, yet they continued moving in the same direction, guided by mutual respect and a shared hope for the generations that would follow. In the end, people did not remember this story because one woman disappeared or because one king carried regret. They remembered it because it proved that losing the future you once expected does not mean losing the future you were meant to create, and that the greatest legacy any heart can leave behind is the courage to build hope where disappointment once lived.